Rocko was a wallaby with clinical anxiety disorder triggered by immigrating to a country that was actively hostile to his existence. Heffer was an abandoned child with binge eating disorder whose biological family replaced him with a pack of wolves. Filburt was so consumed by obsessive compulsive disorder and hypochondria that he could barely function in society. Ed Bighead was a middle-aged toad having a narcissistic breakdown in real time while his marriage collapsed. And the entire show is a psychology autopsy of what late-stage capitalism does to the human mind, hidden behind fart jokes and a cartoon wallaby. What most people do not realize is that Rocko's Modern Life was never a children's show. It was the most psychologically accurate portrait of American despair ever animated, and the writers got it past Nickelodeon by pretending it was about a talking wallaby. Not speculation, clinical analysis. Case 1, Rocko. Let's move. Rocko is an Australian wallaby who moves to America. He gets a job at a comic book store. He rents an apartment. He tries to live a normal life. And every single episode documents his nervous system failing to adapt to an environment that is fundamentally hostile to his existence. Generalized anxiety disorder requires excessive anxiety occurring more days than not for at least 6 months, difficulty controlling the worry, and 3 or more of the following: restlessness, being easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating, irritability, muscle tension, and sleep disturbance. Watch Rocko across any 6-episode stretch. He displays every symptom. The eye twitch alone is a textbook somatic anxiety presentation. Here's what makes Rocko clinically distinct from the other cases. His anxiety is not rooted in childhood trauma. It's environmental. Rocko arrived functional and the environment broke him. Every episode is a new stressor that his nervous system cannot process. Exploitative employment, incomprehensible bureaucracy, predatory consumerism, social isolation. The show is not inventing these scenarios. It is documenting the exact stressors that the clinical literature identifies as triggers for anxiety disorders in immigrant populations. What most people do not realize is that Rocko's Modern Life was created by Joe Murray, who drew heavily from his own experiences of anxiety and alienation. The wallaby is not a random character choice. An Australian wallaby in America is permanently foreign, permanently out of place, permanently trying to understand rules that everyone else seems to know instinctively. That is not a cartoon premise. That is the immigrant experience translated into animation. Case 1, Rocko. Generalized anxiety disorder triggered by environmental stress in the context of cultural displacement. That's the record. Heffer Wolf is a steer raised by wolves. This is a joke the show makes repeatedly. His biological parents abandoned him. A wolf pack took him in. He grew up believing he was a wolf until adulthood, when the biological reality became impossible to ignore. The show played this for absurdist comedy. The clinical reading is not funny at all. When a child is abandoned by their biological family and raised in an environment where they are fundamentally different from everyone else around them, the clinical outcome is predictable. Identity confusion, attachment disruption, a persistent sense of not belonging anywhere. Heffer's response to this is binge eating, a behavior that serves multiple psychological functions. It fills the emptiness. It provides comfort. It builds a physical barrier between himself and the rejection he expects from everyone. Binge eating disorder is characterized by recurrent episodes of eating significantly more food than most people would eat in similar circumstances, accompanied by a sense of lack of control. Heffer does not just eat, he consumes. Entire refrigerators, entire restaurants. The behavior is compulsive, not recreational. And when you trace it back to its origin, a child abandoned at birth, raised by a different species, never able to be what his family expected him to be, the diagnosis is straightforward. Heffer eats because food does not abandon you. Food does not tell you that you are the wrong species. Food is the only reliable source of comfort in a life that has provided none. Someone sat in a production meeting in 1993 and pitched a character who is a cow raised by wolves who eats everything. Everyone laughed. Someone wrote the script, someone animated the scene, and nobody in that room realized they had created one of the most clinically accurate portrayals of post-abandonment binge eating disorder in television history. Case 2. Heffer Wolf. Binge eating disorder rooted in early childhood abandonment and identity confusion. That's the record. Filburt Turtle is the neurotic one, the hypochondriac, the character who spends entire episodes convinced he has contracted a fatal disease because he touched a doorknob or ate a slightly expired sandwich. The show treated this as the nerd archetype, the anxious turtle who cannot function in normal society. The DSM-5 criteria for illness-anxiety disorder, formerly hypochondriasis, requires preoccupation with having or acquiring a serious illness, a high-level anxiety about house, and excessive health-related behaviors. Filburt checks every box, but the diagnosis does not stop there. His social functioning is equally impaired. He cannot maintain eye contact. He cannot sustain conversation. He retreats physically into a shell whenever social interaction becomes overwhelming. These are not separate conditions. They are manifestations of the same underlying anxiety disorder expressing itself through different channels. The obsessive-compulsive traits add another layer. Filburt performs ritualistic behaviors, counting, checking, organizing, that serve to temporarily reduce his anxiety. When the rituals are disrupted, his distress spikes. This pattern of OCD spectrum behaviors co-occurring with social anxiety is well documented in the clinical literature. The two conditions reinforce each other. Social situations trigger health anxiety. Health anxiety triggers compulsive checking. Compulsive checking makes social situations more difficult. Things get even crazier when you realize this. Filburt is not just the comic relief. He is the most clinically dense character on the show. His anxiety-colonized existence is portrayed with an accuracy that most live-action dramas never achieve. Every glance, every stammer, every retreat into the shell. Someone on the writing staff understood clinical anxiety intimately, and they gave all of it to a cartoon turtle. Case 3. Filburt Turtle. Social anxiety disorder with comorbid illness anxiety and obsessive-compulsive features. The most clinically complete portrait in the show. Ed Bighead hates his job. He hates his neighbors. He hates his life. He expresses these hatreds through explosive rage, passive-aggressive scheming, and a running campaign of misery directed at anyone who seems even slightly happier than he is, which is everyone. Ed Bighead is a middle-aged toad working a dead-end corporate job at a company called Nickelodeon that produces products with the slogan, "We own you." The joke is obvious. The clinical reality is that Ed is presenting textbook symptoms of workplace burnout, emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, reduced personal accomplishment, combined with narcissistic rage directed outward because directing it inward would require acknowledging that he is the one who chose this life. His marriage to Bev is equally dysfunctional. Ed treats his wife with the same contempt he directs at everyone else. The show implies multiple affairs. The communication between them is almost entirely antagonistic. And at the center of it all, it is Ed's fundamental narcissistic injury. The gap between who he believes he should be and who he actually is. Ed Bighead believes he deserves power, respect, and admiration. What he has is a cubicle, a boss who does not know his name, and a wallaby neighbor who seems genuinely happy despite having nothing Ed values. What makes Ed clinically interesting, and what separates him from a simpler diagnosis, is that the show occasionally lets the mask slip. These are moments where Ed's rage collapses into something closer to despair. Moments where the camera holds on his face just long enough to register that the anger is a defense mechanism. He cannot face the reality of his own choices, so he attacks everyone else for the crime of existing near him. That's not villainy. That is a midlife crisis rendered in animation, and it is uncomfortable to watch because it is accurate. Case 4. Ed Bighead. Narcissistic rage disorder secondary to chronic workplace burnout, complicated by marital dysfunction. The most adult portrayal in any 90s cartoon. This is a case where the diagnosis shifts from individual characters to the environment itself. Every character in Rocko's Modern Life is psychologically damaged, but the damage does not come from nowhere. It comes from O-Town, an environment designed to extract maximum profit from every living thing inside it. Nickelodeon is not a parody. It is a documentation of corporate America in the 1990s, the era of downsizing, offshoring, and shareholder supremacy. Joe Murray had explicitly stated that the show was a critique of consumer culture and corporate power. What he did not say, but what emerges when you watch the series as an adult, is that he was documenting the clinical consequences of living inside a system designed to extract value from human beings until there is nothing left. Rocko's anxiety is not just immigration stress. It is what happens to a person forced to navigate predatory healthcare, exploitative employment, and incomprehensible bureaucracy. Heffer's binge eating is not just an abandonment trauma. It is what happens when a society offers food as the only affordable comfort. Filburt's hypochondria is not just OCD. It's what happens when healthcare is a product and illness means bankruptcy. Ed's rage is not just narcissism. It is what happens when a person gives their entire life to a corporation that does not know their name. Rocko's Modern Life was not a satire of capitalism. It was a clinical case study of what capitalism does to mental health, delivered in 11-minute segments between commercials for very products that the show was critiquing. We did not have the vocabulary to name what we were watching in 1993. Now we do. Case 5. O-Town itself. Environmental etiology. The disease was never the characters. The disease was the world they were forced to live in. 5 cases, 5 diagnoses, 1 conclusion. Rocko's Modern Life was never a children's show. It was a psychological autopsy of the American dream performed by animators who understood clinical psychology well enough to hide their diagnoses inside cartoon wallabies and talking cows. Rocko's anxiety is the immigrant experience. Heffer's eating disorder is abandonment trauma. Filburt's OCD is what happens when anxiety colonizes every aspect of a person's existence. Ed's rage is the end stage of a life sold to a corporation that never loved him back. And O-Town, the setting itself, is the pathogen. The environment that produced all of this damage and then sold the cure back to the victims as consumer products. Joe Murray and his writers did something unprecedented. They created a cartoon that functions on 2 completely separate levels. For children, it's a silly show about a wallaby and his friends. For adults with clinical training, it is a diagnostic manual in animated form. The same episodes, the same jokes, 2 entirely different shows, depending on what you know how to see. And now you know how to see it. Which case made you realize Rocko's Modern Life was never a kid's show? Drop it in the comments, and hit subscribe.